We will get started. It's 10:30, so we're starting right on time, and we'll see how our time takes us today, but we do have an hour. My name is Dr. Tarpley. I am an upper school administrator, and I oversee the math department, the upper school math team here at Christian Life Preparatory School. And I was really grateful that we have the opportunity today to focus on departments, because it gives a chance to kind of pull back the veil and talk about specifically what we're doing in the math department, what we're trying to achieve, and how we're working within that context. When I came on 3 years ago, that was the first year we as an upper school actually had departments. And now we have leads of each of the departments, which is really great to provide direction, guidance, expertise, and facilitate the details in really beneficial ways. So within that context, we're looking today at how to building a culture of math. Glad to see Dr. Martin here too, to have the science counterpart here. So the first thing, and I apologize, the challenge here, not that you need to know the challenge, is that PowerPoint is not smart enough to have an application on top of an application with a slide, which creates difficulties to actually do math with PowerPoint. So let's try this. So we'll adjust our slides. I'm not going into full presentation because we're actually going to be doing math most of the time and not listening to me talk, so we need to kind of get past that. So my first message to you all, which I'm sure you're incredibly aware of, is the fact that the number one impact on a child in their education are their parents. And even research, although I'm not big on saying research says, but research does say that consistent negative communications from parents about math is probably the most detrimental impact on a child's approach and love for math. And so that is to say, when I say, and when I say negative, actually you hear it in schools all the time as well. Another teacher in another department say, oh yeah, I hate math, or math is so hard for me, or yeah, I don't do math anymore, or if a child is at home and they say, I need help with my 5th grade math, you're going to have to ask your dad, or you're going to have to ask your mom. Like, how would I know how to do 5th grade math? And so all these micro communications come at students to a point to where they themselves kind of take on this particular understanding. And so there was a big study done that was published in the Washington Post a couple of years ago. It said, stop telling kids you're bad at math. You're spreading math anxiety like a virus. In other words, so probably upper school math teachers, one of their biggest hurdles is actually home attitude towards math. And I think a lot of that is actually tied to around the fact of why do we need to know and learn math? And that's a really complicated question, actually, and we'll try to dive into that a little bit today on that thing. But, things we can just remind our students is, math does surround us. Math is fundamentally just a modeling of the physical world, right? It and in science kind of go hand in hand. And historically, math and science were relatively insignificant because they don't tie directly to the cultivation of virtue in the human person in Western civilization. So in classical educations, math and science were the lowest on the rung. And then you flip that into modern civilization where science and technology dominate us and in numerous ways drive everything we do. We're here kind of infiltrated. I've got a microphone and a computer and a projector and a camera and another computer. We're kind of surrounded by this stuff, and we all have these things in our pockets. So we're kind of surrounded by it. So now math and science have taken on, there's been an inversion in education in the last, let's say, 120, 130 years in terms of the prioritization of the focus on the human person, the human condition, human flourishing, to how do we use technology, science, and math in order to solve problems for us. And so we kind of live and breathe in that tension as a whole. But so as a result, math deeply surrounds us. Part of it too is that to encourage our children to persevere. So we'll talk about perseverance. We'll talk about risk taking today, and then just to understand the benefits and skills. So we're going to try to do two things today. One is we're going to talk about this piece of math and how we can think about math differently, and then within that context, talk about specifically what we're doing within our math programs as a whole. So why do we teach students math? Any ideas? I'm going to put up here a couple of options. Why do we teach students math? Okay, daily practicality. So that's really important, right? So what are some daily practical applications for math? Budgets? What's that? Okay, hanging things in the home. Recipes. Okay, so if we go through all these, and it's true, there's a lot of practical application to math in daily life. My gut is if we got our kids through probably 6th or 7th grade math, we would be done. I mean, if they had a really good through 7th grade math foundation, they can manage budgets, they can go to the grocery store, they can hang pictures, they can do all these tasks that are really important, right? So then if I'm a student, I may be asking, well, okay, what's beyond that? Right, like how does that relate to, let's say, trade pre-cal? Right, I mean, it is true. I mean, when I build a picnic bench at home with my kids, I actually use trade pre-cal, but you don't need to use trade pre-cal to build a picnic table at home. Advanced professions. So there we have it, jobs and daily functional skills, right? Well, you need it to get a job, like if you're going to be an engineer or you're going to be a scientist. In some instances, if you're going to be certain types of artists, right? So then the student's response may be to that, what? Well, I'm not doing any of that. So help me out here. I'm not quite getting what's going on. And these are real questions, and you know, as you know, students are typically very astute on these types of questions. And so, you know, once you move past Algebra 1, let's say, and now you moved into geometry, or will geometry help you build a picnic table? Well, I'll have a job and buy a picnic table, so I don't want to build a picnic table, right? So you know, we kind of stand in this crisis of defining math in terms of practical skills and in terms of jobs, and it's harder to get a grasp around why we actually care about teaching mathematics, especially as we move into the upper levels. Now, there is no doubt, if a child wants to pursue careers today in the spaces of science, technology, they are going to have a deep understanding of mathematics within that context. So something just for us to ponder as we kind of move through the talk. So profile of math graduate, I'm not going to read all these to you, but I do want to focus on two aspects of it today. One is strong number sense, okay? And number two is the capacity for risk taking, both of which are real, they're depleted overall, I think, within mathematical communities. And so we're going to focus on those areas. The other ones I'll just read. We want them to have solid foundation in mathematical manipulation. We want them to be divergent thinkers. We'll also address that one pretty heavily today. Divergent thinkers is just the fact that there are multiple ways to solve a problem. And when we actually evaluate what is the best way in different circumstances, different paths could be better, right? So if we say, for example, on divergent thinking, you know, in a classroom, six different ways are identified to solve this problem, we probably need to evaluate, you know, okay, one is faster. Well, there are times when fast is better. This one actually has far more conceptual capacities to apply towards other types of scenarios. Well, there's an enormous amount of value there, right? That one's just clever, right? And then we may find one that's kind of a trick, but it's not really helpful because then they may buy into it and then try to apply it in other scenarios that get them in trouble either immediately or down the road. So not all paths are equal, and not all paths are better for the same reasons. And so helping them discriminate along those lines in terms of how we understand that's really important in divergent thinking. Effective mathematical communicators, that is to say, there is a language to mathematics, and oftentimes you find that students struggle mightily on the front of mathematics as they just simply can't interpret the words. Like they can do it, but then if you have them read something about it in terms of like a word problem or application, they can't connect there. And then finally, just mathematics community builder, which is you all. In other words, in the home, especially at the K through 6 level, but even through the 7 through 12, we have to be able to support our students in positive ways. And just think, I'm pretty confident everyone in here has a high school degree, which means you've accomplished all the math that your child is pretty much going to do. You know, it would be equivalent to someone, they'll come to you in 10th grade English and saying, I'm struggling with this, and you say, well, yeah, I really don't understand English. You know, maybe you can ask someone else for help or go online and Google it. No, I mean, engage them, but we'll talk about that as well. So what are our department goals for this year? All right, so within our departments, we set goals, and so I want you to know, what are we working on this year? So we're consistently implement number strings and integrate relational math thinking into the classroom. So we'll talk about that today, but I want you to know, like, this is our focus. It's not to say math, the goals do not mean we have not done this, and it doesn't mean that we're going to perfect it this year. It just means this is part of our program of growth as a whole in terms of where we're focusing. Number 2, identify student habits of thinking and build habits of thinking. So that's kind of an example of that would be when we solve problems, and I'll say this probably 100 times a day, you know, there's a big difference in math between getting the right answer and figuring out how to work a problem. They're two completely different processes. And we want to focus on figuring out problems versus getting to the right answer, because the pathway there is completely different. And so in order to figure out a problem, you have to have habits of thought. And so you actually have to know what the students were thinking when they answered those problems, as opposed to if I gave you all 6 plus 7 and then walked around the room and said, great, we all got it right. You've all shown mastery. Let's move on. All right, so we'll work through that when you take your math test today. And then growing the ability to ask quality questions. So especially in a math classroom, but any classroom, you can have all the bells and whistles, the wonderful videos, bazillions of hours on PowerPoint slides, you know, all this stuff. But really, if you can ask quality penetrating questions in the moment to help facilitate the thinking for students, it can completely transform a classroom. So those are our 3 goals as a team where we're focusing this year, just so you all know as we walk into this year. And we've tried to, the last 3 years, we've tried to just kind of have stepwise progressions as we try to build out the program and grow it. If you have questions along the way, throw your hand in the air, and I'm happy to elaborate or clarify if I'm not being clear. All good? All right. So let's talk about the distinction between algorithmic thinking and relational thinking, okay? Or maybe what's sometimes called memorizing versus building math knowledge. Okay, so there are 2 kind of different ways. They're not saying that one, it's not a, when I say versus, it's not like an either or, but algorithmic thinking tends to be procedural, right? So an easy example would be, how do you multiply 2 fractions? So if I give you 1/2 times 1/3, how would you work that? I know we're doing math today. We really are. Y'all are going to do a lot of math. Okay, so I hear multiply across the top, multiply across the bottom. Numerator times numerator, denominator times denominator. Why do you do that? Anyone tell me why you do that? Because it works. Because it works. I do it and I get the right answer. But the really odd thing is, no one really knows why it works. It just works. I call it math magic, right? You know. Now, if I told you, what's 1/2 of 1/2? 1/4, right? I mean, we could cut up things to show that, right? But that's really the same as 1/2 times 1/2. Why is 1/2 of 1/2 the same as 1/2 times 1/2? It's a different question than how do you solve 1/2 times 1/2? How do you get from 1/2 of 1/2 to 1/2 times 1/2? Okay, so we take a reciprocal, and so we're really dividing by 2. First person who's ever actually communicated that to me when I've asked these questions, which is fantastic. Usually you'll get things like, well, because of means times. Well, why does of mean times? Right? This is kind of an odd thing. Well, because really 1/2 times 1/2 is really 1/2 divided by 2. But if you actually don't know that multiplication and division are the same operation, you can't actually connect the dots because you learn your multiplication facts and you learn your division, and then you do PEMDAS as if like parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, as if they're separate as opposed to them being one operation, right? So this is what we're talking about, you know, figuring out problems versus algorithmic thinking, okay? Procedural math versus actually thinking about the nature of the math and what's going on. And the strength there, of course, is that you build habits of thought and habits of the mind that cultivate the capacities of the mind to be able to see the world and engage the world in all sorts of different ways. Right? The challenge is within modern American education, when we approach math, we typically only approach it algorithmically, procedurally, and we don't actually look at the math from a perspective of what we'll just call figuring it out. Right? So oftentimes students will sit there and they'll look at a problem and then they look at it and they say, well, I don't know the answer. So then their response is to do what? To stop. Which is really weird. I mean, the other day my two younger boys were trying to figure out how to get a little Hot Wheel down the stairs and around the curve on the stairs and all the way down the stairs, without it flying off the track. And I think an hour and a half later I came back and they were still trying to figure out how to get the Hot Wheel down the track around the curve, so they were building these blocks up to try and reduce the speed. And they really didn't know what they were doing, but they were trying to figure it out. And I really don't know that they were ever successful. They probably weren't because the steepness was just overwhelming, the down the curve, and it was just flying off into the wall or whatever. But they didn't just say, well, I can't do that, and just stop. They engage. So children in their nature will try to figure things out and are willing to experiment and try different things, which means they're willing to take risk. Okay, they're willing to take risk and then be wrong. And in being wrong, what did they actually do? They learned something. Walk into the average American math classroom, and no one wants to say the answer unless they know they are correct. And then when they're wrong, And so again, in the upper school, we're trying to work heavily on this culture of risk-taking and figuring things out. They go hand in hand. They're tied and intimately linked together. So here's your chance. You're going to do math. So, I do ask you while we do this. So see, the anxiety immediately is just like, are you joking me? I already did all this. It's behind me. I don't do this anymore. And then I have a little app, which is great, that you can submit your scoring with your name, and then we'll put them up there so everyone can see. No, I'm just joking. I do ask you, though, to just simply follow the sequence. You'll have all sorts of personalities here. Some are actually quietly excited about getting to do the math and being challenged by it. And they won't show it, but they're really aggressively excited to be able to do the problems. And then some of you are like, good grief, I should have gone to the K through 6 and I would be avoiding this misery. If you'll just stay on the page I ask you to stay on, though. Okay, don't flip ahead as we go. I would be appreciative of that as well, because some of you will pick it up inevitably and race through them and then go to the next one. Okay, so this is very simple. All I want you to do is just work the problem. That's all I want you to do. Okay? I didn't do the K through 6 lower school district. Yeah, I wasn't in charge of it. So you're going to take one and pass it around. Yep, just go ahead and get started. You have 30 seconds. Just relax, work the problems, cover your work, so the neighbor doesn't make you copy your answers. No stress. Can y'all hear me if I talk right here? No. Okay. Yeah, that's a problem. Okay. So we're going to stop right there and just first reflect on In working those problems, what do you think we value right now as a community in this room? You know, what's one of the elements that's valued a lot in terms of getting them done?
Accuracy.
What's that? Accuracy?
Speed.
Speed. Right? The people who are good at math are what? Fast. Because faster is better. Right? Which is really unfortunate in math, because faster isn't necessarily better. There are times when fast is good, but the majority of the time faster is not better. So one of the things we'll work on a lot in class is, you know, transitioning out of having, you know, the student throw their hand up really quick when they get the answer, because as soon as their hand goes up, everyone else's brains do what? Turn off, right? And then the child doesn't even get the opportunity to move into their capacities to have a much better thought, perhaps, than the student who was really fast. So, you know, what happens in this space is, you know, people race to go through them really quickly, which again isn't in itself per se a problem, but it is what we put a premium on typically in math classes, which is the faster you are, the better you are. And of course, if you're accurate and fast, you know, if you're the kid in around the world in second grade who obliterates the whole world over and over and over again in the classroom, just moving around with their facts, right? Then you must be the best at math in the class. So we've got to work on that aspect. So what I want you to do is just take a few minutes and talk to your neighbors about how you, let's just start with number one, how did you actually think about solving the problem? How did you work it? What were you thinking? How were you dealing with the numbers when you worked the problems? So just maybe find 2, 3, 4 people and just start with number one, 23 plus 35. How did you solve that problem? So talk for a minute. Offer your ideas. Now, the biggest concern when you turn to your neighbor is that you might have gotten one of them wrong, and then they're going to think, well, gosh, they're really dumb. I mean, they missed 23 plus 35, right? Again, it's no different in the classroom, and so just like if we're wanting our children to be able to cultivate habits of mind, they've got to be able to take risks. They've got to understand that through making mistakes, they're going to learn in this process. And that, you know, we have to be able to share and explore. So only give me one way you could work 23 plus 35. Oh, come on. What's that?
The ones place and the tens place.
Okay, so I see someone doing this, which I'm assuming is line them up, right? So we could do it algorithmically. That would look like 23 plus 35 gives me 58, right? Now, what skill did you actually have to possess mathematically to do it that way? Okay, so it's the algorithmic approach, but what is the math skill you needed to be able to do? You have to be able to count, right? It's a counting approach. In other words, algorithmic approaches always try to reduce math to the level of counting, which your kids learn to do in kindergarten. Which is kind of strange, right? Because they could think of what we call additive functioning or multiplicative ways or proportional ways. There's all sorts of ways to think about math, that we tend to try to reduce everything to just counting, right? What's another way we could have worked this? Okay, so we could have modified the algorithmic way to kind of have an algorithmic shortcut, right? Because of course, when you add 2 and 3, you get 5, right? Because that's what that number really means. 20 and 30 mean 2 and 3. Of course they don't, right? 20 and 30 mean 20 and 30. And if you're confused on that, I'd like to do money deals with you after this session. I'll trade you my $2 for your $20 over and over again. So we can see that it doesn't actually make mathematically foundational sense to say that you're adding 2 and 3, because you're not adding 2 and 3, you're really adding what? 20 and 30. So give me another way to work this problem. Pick up your phone and turn on your calculator. Okay, great. Okay, so what did you say? Okay, so she added 20 to 35 and got 55, and what did you have left over there? You saw that 3, so then you added that 3. Great. What's another way you could have thought about this? Or you did think about it? Okay, so we could say 20 plus 30 and 3 plus 5. 58. We could have just given this 3 over to the 5, right? Got 38 and then added 20 and got 58. Right? So there's different ways, and notice that people think about them in different ways. Unless you've been, the algorithmic way is your kind of default. All right, let's look at another one. 43 plus 77. How do we work this one? Okay, so he took the 3, gave it to the 77, and turned that into what? 80. And that left me with 40, which means the answer must be 120. Right. Someone think about it differently? I mean, you could have added the 40 and 70 and got what? 110, and known the 7 and 3 is what? A 10, and dealt with it that way. All right, let's look at the next one. Where did I hit? Sorry. I do that sometimes with this. Sorry about that. How do we do this one? You can line it up, right? You can line it up, stack it, carry your ones. Well, you're carrying ones, right? You're either carrying a 10 or you're carrying a 100. Not a 1. Yeah. I mean, this is how we're trained, right? But I want you to feel the difference between algorithmic thinking and actually mathematical relational thinking, right? So you're not carrying a 1 when you take it above the hundreds. You're carrying 100. And again, if you want to do business with me afterwards, I'd love to do business at the hundreds level. So how do we think about this one? Okay, so he wants to go 47 plus 61, and he sees he can get 180. You don't actually have to carry, right? So that makes it pretty nice. And then 100 plus 200 must be 300, so that worked out pretty well, right? You may notice you have a 6 and a 4 makes a 10 right there, right? Okay, and then makes 100. Makes 100, and so then you go to 400 and you have an 8 left over. So there's different ways to map this question.
The larger the numbers involved, the more likely I am to go formulaic.
The larger the numbers involved, the more likely you are to go formulaic. And of course, when you deal with money itself in real life, that's absolutely not what you do, right? In other words, if I had $1,352,428, do I care about the $428 when I'm thinking about that number? No, I think about the fact that I have $1.3 million, right? So it's really interesting. Again, going back to algorithmic tends to take you back to counting. And so you default to the smaller numbers because as long as it's between 0 and 9, it seems to be a very safe space. But the idea that I have $100 and $200 is $300, that's not threatening. And if I had 40 and 60, that would be another $100. So now I've got $400 in my pocket, like no one's complaining about that. And then I've got some spare change of 7 and 1, I've got $8. I got $408. All right, let's talk about subtraction. 42 minus 20. How do we think about that one? This requires participation. Yes? Okay, so we did 4 minus 2 is 2, right? That's what that means, right? It means 40 minus 20 is 20. And then we did 2 minus 0, which is 2, right? How else could you have thought about this, or did someone else think about it? Okay, so reflectively answered it. So at that point, I call those anchors. You've got an anchor in your mind there. And again, this isn't to diminish memorization, but oftentimes if you do things enough times, what do? You memorize them, right? Which is different from just brute force memory, where, for example, we'll look at an example of that later with high school students that I see over and over again. What's another way? Well, we could have said we really just have a 40 and a 20, right? But then I dropped 2 out, so I need to give 2 back, so I must have 22, a give and a take. Right? So did it get...
You're taking away almost half of the 42, and with 1 extra.
Yeah, so that's good. So we could say 42, so we're almost taking away half. Half is 21. So I know it's 21, but then I need to give 1 more, that's 22. Anyone come up with other ways? Yes? Very good. So we could have started with 20 and asked ourselves, how do we get to 42? Right? Well, that's pretty easy. We just add 20 and then add 2. So the difference must be 22. This is called number sense. The capacity to understand numbers, build relationships between numbers, utilize numbers, build habits of thinking so that you begin to see the world in ways that maybe you hadn't thought about them before. There's carryover to those. Again, it's not to minimize algorithmic thinking, but it's to say stacking them on top of each other and adding them up and carrying, not to mention the fact that it does miscommunicate what's actually happening in the math a little bit, but also how does that carry over to your day-to-day? Well, if you're in the grocery store or whatever it may be. So not to minimize those. All right, let's look at a fun one. 70 minus 43. How'd you do this one? All right, I saw the hands go up like this again from a few of you. So let's do that. 70 minus 43. What's my first step? Which is incredibly intuitive to kids, right? It makes complete sense to them. Yeah, you can't take 0 minus 3, can you? I mean, really, you can't. I mean, you can't do 0 minus 3. That's not possible. Right? I mean, you can't have $0 and go in debt $3, right? That's impossible. I mean, no, really, I mean, it's negative 3, right? 0 minus 3 is a negative 3. But here we say, well, you can't go 0 minus 3. Does everyone see the disconnect there? What's happening? Okay. So now algorithmically say you can't go 0 minus 3, which you can. What we're saying here is inapplicable to what's going on. So we're going to borrow how much? A 1. That's what we say. From the 7 and give it to the 0. So now it's 10 minus 3, so now we're back to counting. And 6 minus 4 is 2, and we're done. And of course we didn't borrow a 1, we borrowed a 10, right? And we can subtract 0 minus 3. We just can't do it here because that's how the algorithm runs. That's why like numerator times numerator, denominator times denominator, right? It's the math magic. What's another way we could have done this? How many? Okay, so if we're at 43, I want to get to 50, right? So that's a plus 7, and then I now need to get to 70, so that's a plus 20, right? Great. You could have just done 70 minus 40, right? And then knowing that you need to get 3 more off there to get to 27. All right, we could do this all day, I know, but we can't. 8 times 7, one of the hardest math facts to memorize in the history of math. What is 8 times 7? 56. And as you kind of, the smorgasbord of your math facts, as your child starts to eliminate them, this will end up being probably one of the last 3 or 4. You'll think, my gosh, why can my child not just remember this one, right? Oh, I know what I do. I tell them it's 8 times 7 is 56 because it goes 5, 6, 7, 8. Which is really helpful because that's completely applicable to their mathematical building, right? I mean, I've done that before. I'm like, look, you got to know it by tomorrow. So just remember when you say 8 times 7, it's 5, 6, 7, 8, and you're on your way. But that's not really helpful to them. So besides memorizing 8 times 7, how did some of you maybe figure it out?
Count by 8.
Okay, so count by 8s. So skip count.
8 squared minus 8.
Okay, so it went 8 times 8 is 64, and now we need to peel off how much? Okay, and peeling off 8 is not too hard because we're really just subtracting 4 and then subtracting 4, right? What's another way we could have gone at it? Yep.
I remember 8 times 3 is 24, and if that's why I added 8.
Excellent. So he started with the anchor he knew, which is this. Then he did it a second time, so he knows that's going to double it, right? Right? And then he added 8 more, and it got him up to 56. Great. A lot of people do this. They tend to remember the ones that are like 6 times 6, 7 times 7, 8 times 8, they're perfect squares, right? So 7 times 7 is just 49, and now we need to tack on how much? We have to tack on 7 more, so we're going to add 1 to get to 50, and then add 6 to get to 56. Are those wrong? No, I mean, this one's actually quite creative, right? To recognize the relationship of, oh, that's 8 times 6, that's, I know 8 times 3, and then I can get to 8 times 6, and that gets me to 8 times 7. Right? Or 7 times 7 and work up, or 8 times 8 and work backwards. Or, skip counting isn't a bad method, but it's a lower math in terms of the hierarchy of capacities. That's more on the counting side, but it's not a problem. I wouldn't sit there and tell a kid you're wrong, right? All right, any others we want to dive into? Let's look at, let's see, what's another good one? Let's do 6 times 89. How do we go with that one? What's that?
6 times 80 and 6 times 9.
Okay, so he did 6 times 80 and 6 times 9 to make his life easier. He got 480 and 54. And I assume you added those at that point, right? Okay. And again, how you add those up, we've talked about addition, so there's different ways you could have gone at that. What's another way you could have gone at it? Okay, you could have just gone 6 times 90 and said that's 540. And then too many 6s did you have in there now? 1, and so we just take off 6, and that would take me to 534. Right? You could have done this. Now you're back to 9 times 6 is 4, so of course you're carrying your 5, right? And now you have 6 times 8 is 48, but now oddly you're adding 5 to 48. So different ways we could have gone at that. Again, 98 times 31 is a similar situation. How could we do this one? These are big numbers. Actually, I'm going to skip this one, come right back to it. How do we do that one? Yeah, so you just added a 0, right? Because 785 plus 0 is 785, right? Again, our language defies us, right? We want to be effective math communicators, and we say we add a 0, but then we actually increase it by an exponential amount of 10. So it's kind of a strange part of our language. So the answer is actually what? 7,850. So, I mean, what's a way we could actually express that? 785 times 10. We really have how many tens?
You're adding a multiple of 10.
You are adding a multiple of 10. So you want to add 785 10 times? Does that sound fun? Probably it's easier to think of it as you have 785 tens, right? That's easier for you to think about. And of course, then you have how much money? $7,850, right? So let's go back to that previous one. I should have switched those when I did them. 98 times 31. How can we do this one? Yeah, good. So we can do 100 times 31. Gonna add 2 zeros, right? Just kidding. And now what do we got to do? Yeah. So we had how many extra 31s did we have? We had 2. So how do we get rid of that? Those 2 extra 31s. Yeah. So we'll subtract 62, but that's kind of a headache. So we could really just subtract what? 60. It's pretty easy, and then subtract how much more? Or we could have done this. Why does that go there? It's a placeholder. It doesn't tell me why it goes there. Because you have to move it over. That's true. Why do you have to move it over? Oh, so you're multiplying by tens instead of multiplying by ones. Yep. That's a hard one for kids. 4, now we're going to carry our 2. Not really, carry our 100. Then we're going to add all that up, right? Okay. So, again, I'm not saying this is wrong to learn. I just want us to see the distinction between algorithmic thinking and relational math thinking. And when you actually talk with math people, that is to say, like high-level mathematicians, they actually almost exclusively think relationally. And one of the interesting things about them, they are like humanities people in the sense that, like when I teach my history course, I don't, because new ideas will come to me. I'll read a book. I'll think about things differently, right? So you're continually learning and thinking about the world in terms of history differently. And really for mathematicians, they've done studies where they'll have a mathematician do a problem, and then 1 year later come back and have it again, they'll do it completely different because their research is driving them to think about numbers in different ways and in progressions and stuff like that. So math can be very, very dynamic in how we think about these problems and relate to them and engage them. Any questions over that process? So again, our goal for this year is to integrate relational thinking. We're not only doing relational thinking, but to be able to integrate ways and within that process to encourage risk-taking, and within that concept of encouraging risk-taking, to be able to look at the habits of thought that the students are having as they're working through these in order to build those habits to make them increasingly flourishing human beings and not just simply mathematical machines. Okay. Any questions? All right. So 5 times anything, so we don't have time to dig into this, but I just want us to think about it. 5 times anything, really is a way to do that, is 10 times anything and take half of it. Right? A lot of times students will do that. 5 times 23. I don't know that, but I know 10 times 23 is 230, and what's half of 230? 115. I can manage that much easier. So 5 times 23 must be 115. We looked at these, so we're not going to... So fractions, and people say, well, this is all nice and great, but can you actually get to calculus this way? Well, the answer is yes, you can get to calculus this way. So if we had a half and a tenth, what's really a good way to think about a half and a tenth? What's a good default for students? Okay, so we could say 5/10, so we just did equivalent expression, so we're working algorithmically there. We could think about it in terms of money. So a half is really what? 50 cents. And 1/10 is really just a dime. And if you had 50 cents and 10 cents, you really have how much? Oh, you have 60 cents. Not sure where that went. So now we have 60 cents out of 100 cents, but we really need to get that down because they're going to ask us to reduce it. So really, how many dimes are in each of those? 6 and 10. Or we could have thought, well, if I had sets of 20 cents, that would really have been just 3 and 5 sets of 20 cents. Right? But notice, just reflecting on your brain and how your brain is processing through that mode, it's a different way of thinking about it, and for a lot of students, it's easier when you're actually building relationships as opposed to going through the process of, and I'm doing more elementary work right now, not in any way to position y'all, but just so that we can all relate to what we're talking about. All right, let's look at some ACT stuff. So if you turn the page, I give you 3 ACT problems, and I just want to talk about these for a minute, and then we will wrap up. So the first one, I don't want you to work it. I just want you to look at it. What's one of the first things that strikes you about the problem when you just look at it? What's that? Yeah. There's lots and lots of words in the problem. So one of the actual real challenges for math classes beyond just the computational side of things is the reading comprehension side. And so as you look at your children's abilities to flourish in math, it's always good to look at the reading comprehension side of this because that requires a lot of reading and interpretation, which can be quite challenging for students, even if the math on this one is incredibly simple, okay? Let's look at number 2. I want you to work number 2, but you can't put your pencil on the paper. So what's the answer? Okay, we have a 99. Anyone think something else? So if you quote stop doing math and actually just, which I don't like this language, but people say, oh, well, I should have stopped doing math and just thought about it. No, actually math is thinking, you figuring things out. So, I mean, the average student, if you just threw this in front of them and said, look, here's your average right now for your 4 tests, and you need to get to an 80 average, what kind of grade do you need to get in order to get your average to an 80? And you said, here are your 4 choices. You can get any of these test scores. Which one would you have to have? You would have to have a 99. Getting 70s does not raise your average to an 80. It's like when you see a student get an answer and they'll say, well, I think the answer is, 73. No, really, it was like 124 times 278. Like you can't get a smaller number, right? But that's number sense as well. So looking at this problem, this is an ACT problem, I'd encourage students just to again, have some capacities for number sense and thinking, just say, well, how could it be anything but 99? And then actually see that as understanding numbers and solving the problem in an acceptable way. Same thing with number 3. We'll just look at that one briefly and then we'll be done. If I have x squared minus 36x, this is our high-level problem for the day. What you should realize is that whatever this is and whatever this is have to equal what? 0, which means this has to be the same as this. Well, if this is x and this is 36 and x, then what does x have to be? It has to be 36. It couldn't be anything else. But naturally, a student's mind doesn't go there. They think, well, I need to factor out the x, or I need to do this or this or this or this. When in reality, they're not really understanding the nature of the property of something equaling 0. Right? Like I say, elephants minus elephants are 0. Elephants to the 0 power is always 1. So I always do that with my kids at home, just joke with them. So anyway, so I will say this. You all should have tremendous confidence whatever grade your child is in the teachers that we have in our school, and in this case, I'm talking about our math department. We have people who love math, who think math, and Ms. Tubbs is here, Ms. Lewis is here, Mr. Madison is here, and teach me a lot about math as we go, and so that's important. We need to be continued learners. So if you have questions for me regarding upper school math, I'd love to support you in that process. And our goal for all of our students is to close gaps and grow their abilities to understand and think math. That is our exclusive focus, to close gaps and grow their learning. So thank y'all.